Good evening, everyone. My name's Debbie Anderson, and I'm the Assistant Director of Education and Engagement. Thank you for joining us today for our first ever Heart in Hand virtual book talk. The Heart in Hand virtual book talk series was developed as part of our library's equity initiative. These talks feature discussions on thought provoking literature and conversations with authors and speakers to challenge existing perceptions about systemic racism and injustice against people of color. Heart in Hand hopes to inspire people to open their hearts and minds to learning about diverse experiences and challenge them to further action and learning. Today, we're featuring a conversation about the legacy of Bruce's Beach and other key African American leisure sites in California history. To help kick off the start of our first program, we have a very special guest who is very familiar with Bruce's Beach and has been absolutely instrumental in leading the county's effort to return the land to the Bruce family descendants. So please join me in welcoming 4th District Supervisor Janice Hahn. Welcome, Supervisor Hahn.
Thank you, Deborah. And first, I would like to acknowledge the first peoples of this unceded land which we currently occupy. And with respect to their elders, past and present, we recognize the Chumash, the Quiche, the Serrano, the Tataviam, and the Tongva as the original stewards of this land, air, and water, and provide our support as they continue to lift up their stories and cultures. It's great to be with you all tonight, and thank you. And a big shout out to my wonderful director of our county libraries, Skye. Thank you for being a part of this event tonight as well. And thanks for holding this special event to talk about the legacy of Bruce's Beach. This conversation is so important right now because within the next few months, Los Angeles County will be officially returning the beachfront property that was once Bruce's Beach Resort to the living descendants of Willa and Charles Bruce. It will mark the first time in American history that a government has returned property unjustly taken from African Americans. I'm embarrassed to say that I did not know the story of Willa and Charles Bruce and how their land was taken from them by the city of Manhattan Beach until very recently. I grew up in Los Angeles County and I learned to swim in the ocean just a few blocks away from Bruce's Beach, but this history wasn't widely known or discussed. And I think that's part of the reason why it took so long for actions to be taken on returning this land. And that is why the work of historians like Dr. Alison Rose Jefferson and Dr. Anthony Lee and the conversations like the one happening here tonight are so important. We can't address the wrongs of the past if we don't know about them. We have to, as a society, start talking about our history and telling the truth, not just about Bruce's Beach, but the injustices just like it that happened across this country. When I first announced that I wanted to return Bruce's Beach to the Bruce family, I was asked if I was worried that it might set a new precedent. And I always answer the same way. I hope it does. I hope that when LA County succeeds in returning Bruce's Beach, we can inspire communities and government leaders to take a hard look at their own local histories and find ways to address the injustices of the past. Ultimately, I hope that becomes the legacy of Bruce's Beach, a painful story, but also one about a country trying to heal itself and make families who were harmed whole. Thank you all so much for joining tonight and for lifting up the Bruce family's story. I know this is going to be a great conversation.
Thank you, Supervisor Hahn, and thank you so much for your inspirational leadership. Many across the nation were inspired by the county's effort to return Bruce's Beach to its descendants. And one of these individuals, Professor Dr. Anthony Lee, was so inspired that he donated a vast array of texts about African and African American history to help LA County Library develop a new collection called the Bruce's Beach Commemorative Collection. The collection is scheduled to open later this year at the Manhattan Beach Library. And Dr. Lee has prepared a special message about the inspiration behind his donation and what he hopes the collection will become. And so we'd like to play Dr. Lee's message for you now.
I'm really happy to be a part of this session. My name's Anthony Lee, and I'm a retired professor of African and African American history. And I recently decided to donate my collection of books on those two subjects to the Manhattan Beach Public Library, the county library there. And I was asked to explain why I did that. I was recently part of the Bruce's Beach Task Force in Manhattan Beach, which was looking into ways to address that history. But the real inspiration for my interest and my donation comes from Alison Rose Jefferson, who you will hear from shortly, who has done the pioneering work of uncovering the history of Bruce's Beach in her book. She also deals with other Black resorts in Southern California. So the history is that a small Black community and Black neighborhood began to emerge in Manhattan Beach at the beginning of the century. And for a while, it was tolerated by the white residents of the city who were not upset, really, to have a segregated community in the north of the city. But after World War I, and this happened all over the country when it became clear that Black people were moving north and were determined to exercise the rights of citizenship all over the country and in Manhattan Beach, there was simply a campaign of ethnic cleansing, which removed Black people from rural areas and suburbs. So my donation to the library of a full collection of 1,200 books or something on African and African American history was my effort to attract Black scholars and the Black public that is curious to the city of Manhattan Beach in a symbolic effort, really, to restore a Black presence to the city, one that was lost 100 years. And I thank Dr. Jefferson for her inspiration.
It was such a pleasure hearing from Dr. Lee. And we thank Dr. Lee for his incredible generosity of the Bruce's Beach Commemorative Collection. And now it's time for our main event. Today, we are featuring an engaging conversation with LA County Library Director Skye Patrick and guests Dr. Alison Rose Jefferson and Dominique DiPrima. Dr. Alison Rose Jefferson is the author of today's featured book, Living the California Dream: African American Leisure Sites in the Jim Crow Era. Dr. Jefferson's research and professional interest revolve around the intersection of historical memory, American history, the history of the African American experience in Southern California during the 20th century Great Migration and Jim Crow era, heritage conservation, spatial justice, and cultural tourism. We are also joined by Dominique DiPrima, veteran radio personality and host of the morning talk show First Things First on KBLA Talk 1580 AM. DiPrima is the first ever Black female drive time talk radio host west of the Mississippi. Prior to being the host of First Things First, DiPrima produced and hosted The Front Page on Stevie Wonder's Los Angeles radio station for 16 years. She also spent 3 years as a co-host of the Steve Harvey Morning Show and has held other posts in radio and television. In addition to her media work, DiPrima is a dedicated community activist with a passion for spreading awareness and advancing social justice for marginalized communities of color. And moderating tonight's conversation is our library director, Skye Patrick. Skye Patrick was appointed LA County Library Director in 2016. In her role, she's responsible for the library's 86 locations, 18 vehicle mobile fleet, and the 3.4 million customers that use its resources. Patrick is committed to breaking down barriers and increasing access for all. In addition to helping LA County Library go fine-free and initiating a myriad of other services to help provide more access and opportunities for customers, Patrick launched the library's iCount Equity Initiative. iCount ensures that library services and programs address the needs of the diverse communities across LA County. And Patrick continues to reinforce the library's role in the community as a civic and cultural center, a hub for public information, services, and discourse, and an institution of literacy, innovation, and lifelong learning. So thank you, Dr. Jefferson, Dominique, and Skye, for being here tonight. And Skye, I'll hand the program over to you now.
Thank you so much, Debbie. She does such a great job introducing us every time. She's going to be our mistress of ceremonies at all of these programs. So welcome everyone to our first ever Heart and Hand virtual book talk. I was so surprised and intrigued by the historical insight about African American leisure sites that Dr. Jefferson's book discusses. So to shed a little bit of light on Bruce's Beach and other historical sites, Dr. Jefferson has prepared a presentation for us. After today's programs, I highly encourage you, if you have not read the book, to check this book out from one of our libraries. And Dr. Jefferson, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to get my presentation up. Okay, we're going to be rocking and rolling here in just a second. I want to thank Dr. Lee for the generous introduction, and I commend Dr. Lee also for his effort to engage the community in learning more about the history of African Americans and other people who have been marginalized in our history in the nation. And I thank the library for inviting me to participate today in this program. And I'm so happy that our audience has found that this is a subject that they would like to learn more about. So African Americans began, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get this. Is this in the full screen, please? Do you guys see the PowerPoint in the full screen?
Yes. Looks like you could make it bigger, Dr. Jefferson.
Okay, so is there we go?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Thank you. So African Americans began moving in larger numbers to the Los Angeles environs in the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century, joining a multi-ethnic community of whites and people of color, as well as immigrants from many national backgrounds. The majority of new Black migrants relocated from American Southern states. Their stories are about public and private memories of African Americans of all social classes. The new Negro who migrated out of the South to northern, Midwestern, and far Western places in the decades following World War I to escape the worst of Jim Crow era racism, anti-Black restrictions, and racial violence. These migrants were more self-confident and sometimes militant in demanding their rights as citizens and as consumers. similar to other groups who migrated, similar to other groups who moved to the state. African Americans embraced the booster promoted California dream of a leisure lifestyle as a permanent way of life in picturesque outdoor settings, a mild climate, and new life opportunities. Even while discrimination and lax enforcement of California's civil rights laws, established as early as 1893, many times prevented them from using various public or private facilities and buying land in many areas for decades into the 20th century. Despite the challenges, African Americans actively participated in California's development throughout the early 20th century Great Migration. They bought homes and other property, raised families, launched businesses, created social and faith institutions, and nurtured a rich cultural milieu that included the emergence of West Coast jazz. My work as a historian and heritage conservation consultant is a social justice action practice to expand knowledge for construction of a more inclusive public culture, historical memory, and national identity, encompassing the diverse experiences of the American people, and to dismantle institutional racism. Today, I am going to share some stories of once. Today, I am going to share some of the once forgotten stories I reconstruct and reinsert into civic memory through different programming modes, such as my recent book, Living the California Dream: African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Black Californians made American history by challenging racial and class hierarchies when they claimed space from colonial times to their occupation and claiming a public recreation space at the core of California's formative 20th century identity, as the Reverend Darius Stokes quote alludes to, that's on your screen. These places were sites of resistance, rebellion, and joy in the development of attractive inland resorts and beaches relatively free from white harassment. I offer a view of overlooked extraordinary community builders and socioeconomic development experiences of the Black Americans of all classes, and the impact of leisure that intersects with the influence of the diverse output of the Harlem Renaissance and the new Negro experience as a cultural movement of national and global phenomena. These stories of social economic development initiatives are about African Americans who sought to seize their California and American dream to appropriate and shape the offerings of their new environment in the far West, as they fought for equal access to California's recreation and relaxation offerings and contributed to the broader U.S. freedom rights struggle during the nation's Jim Crow era from the 1900s to the 1960s. Leisure was not an optional add-on to civil rights, but an essential component of liberty. In addition to the Bruce's Beach story that unfolded in Manhattan Beach, which I'll give a few more details about shortly, I examine other Los Angeles County places and places in other counties in the region that African Americans enjoyed for varying periods of time during this era that include Santa Monica's South Beach neighborhoods and Venice, also Eureka Villa in the Santa Clarita Valley, all of these in LA County, and in Riverside County, Lake Elsinore, and Corona's Park Ridge Country Club, and a few other places. Race, power, privilege, and wealth often influence leisure opportunities, just as it determined who was able to take advantage of economic and social opportunities in California. Even with these impacts, African Americans, in their building and enjoyment of these leisure communities through creative assertion, claimed and performed full humanity and civic membership, along with social and economic resourcefulness and self-determination. As Californians undertook leisure, many found it restricted and themselves excluded from the way of life. White boosters broadcasted this rhetoric and imagery about leisure lifestyle pleasures as messages in mass media, speaking to white consumers to create a sense of place in California's social and physical landscape that excluded Jewish people and communities of color. In the white boosters' message, people of color were situated as laborers, if at all, rather than neighbors or social equals. This history is layered with stories about group and individual circumstances and chronicles about migration patterns, socioeconomic status, cultural practices, and education and employment opportunities, as well as social power. These intersecting and overlapping experiences and stories took place in private and public spaces. They are inseparable from one another in their composition and reflection of the structural racial exclusion and class exploitation imposed on African Americans and other marginalized groups. As Afro-Californians embraced the booster dream of a leisure lifestyle, at the same time, they contested attempts of what the California Eagle newspaper identified as confinement to sordid forms of recreation and play to assert self-determination in leisure. Astute African American entrepreneurs and civic builders in Southern California and around the nation recognize how how this embrace of leisure combined with real estate investment and other business opportunities could create income, wealth, and joy for visitors. Social networking, community building, and cultural tradition and economic development occurred at these sites, marking a space of Black identity on the regional landscape and social space. In pursuit of emotional and physical rejuvenation and unwilling to accept exclusion, Black Americans around the nation developed separate leisure spaces to circumvent the era's oppressive racist subjugation as they promoted a renewed sense of racial pride, cultural self-expression, economic independence, and a mix of progressive political perspectives that were the embodiment of the new Negro determined to achieve fuller participation in American society. The experiences and memories of these destinations and the attention they gained in public memory and newspapers of the era offered African Americans new and broader visions of themselves, a new identity, a new collective sense of freedom, contributing to cultural and intellectual efforts that defined the new Negro. Black Californians in their ambitions and initiatives radically claimed, challenged, and promoted the state's identity in the consumption of leisure as a lifestyle that spread across the country to develop a new American suburban middle-class culture and identity in the early 20th century. Transgressing social spaces as they asserted self-determination to participate in popular leisure and resort cultural, social, and economic trends that were considered modern by the 1920s. In ex-urban communities, African Americans bought property so they could control their enjoyment of these activities and contest anti-Black racism. Particularly, they were challenging white prejudice and power in the labeling of African Americans as laborers and as inferior. Bruce's Beach and other sites discussed in my book each has its own history of development of leisure of a specific sort in social, political, and economic particulars, as well as racialized issues of the time and place. In my book, I have reconstructed our understanding of the fuller shared collective history of the range of community builders and their impact and contributions to these places and the Southern California region. In this context, in 1912, entrepreneurs Willa and Charles Bruce purchased Pacific oceanfront land to create a resort service business that became known as Bruce's Beach between 26th and 27th Street in the city of Manhattan Beach. Their business and the area became a very popular gathering place for African Americans of all social classes on weekends and in the summertime. Other African Americans bought land and built cottages nearby. Within a day of the small resort's opening, some local white property owners took action through use of public power to harass and contest the leisure of the Bruce's patrons, as described in a Los Angeles Times Monday, June 27th, 1912 article headlined, "Colored People's Resort Meets with Opposition." Written after a Sunday full of visitors at the Bruce Resort, the article noted landowner and city founder George H. Peck staked off and installed no trespassing signs on his acreage between the Bruce property and the ocean. Simultaneously, two deputy constables patrolling the prohibited strip warned Bruce resort patrons not to cross Peck's land to reach the ocean. The Times reported this small inconvenience did not deter the African American bathers from walking the half-mile around Peck's land to spend the day swimming and jumping in the breakers. Mrs. Bruce became somewhat of a cause célèbre as well as an irritation source to the local white supremacists. Despite the Sunday harassment, when interviewed by the Los Angeles Times correspondent, Mrs. Bruce asserted the business would continue. Clearly informed about the market for her new enterprise and trends in local real estate development, Mrs. Bruce expressed awareness that prior to her arrival, African Americans had not been able to purchase land for a beach resort and did not have bathing privileges at any of the Pacific Coast bathhouses. The pioneering Willa Bruce declared to the Times she was prepared to fight to keep her establishment. White Manhattan Beach property owners publicly declared to the Times they deplored the state of the affairs of this new resort and its clientele and vowed to find a remedy if the Negroes tried to stay. This 1912 exchange set the stage for several future rounds of private and public contestation in Manhattan Beach between the African American protagonists and white property owners with white supremacist views. Until its forced closure in the mid-1920s, the popular year-round seaside gathering place was a financially successful enterprise for the Bruces. It drew Afro-Angelinos and others to one of the few places locally where they could enjoy the Pacific Coastline's offerings with minimal harassment. By the early 1920s, the remote, small African-American enclave with Bruce's Lodge as its focal point claimed place through commerce and residency. This claim provoked some concerned, increasingly vocal white citizens' belief a Negro invasion was in progress, which would have an adverse effect on property values. Legal sanctions and private actions using public power as a harassment tactic from new city ordinances, Ku Klux Klan intimidation, and other things were implemented to discourage African Americans from visiting, walking up and down the shoreline, and settling in Manhattan Beach. During this time period, the African American owned California Eagle newspaper issued a call of alarm that transplanted white supremacists from Texas were attempting to restrict colored Americans from the oceanfront. They reminded their readers that California had civil rights laws that made it illegal to discriminate against all citizens in public places, such as the oceanfront. After the white supremacist harassment tactics failed, a proposal to condemn the Manhattan Beach northern neighborhood to create a park through eminent domain proceedings was submitted by private white citizens to the city council and was eventually passed in 1924. When challenges to these proceedings were unsuccessful, the evicted Bruce's Beach property owners settled for the most favorable sale price they could obtain. Now, whether they were adequately compensated for their land has remained open to debate into the 21st century. Racist exclusionary measures aided by destructive use of state power in 1924 eliminated their residential and socioeconomic development with attempts to erase the site's memory from history. Only through political assertion has a limited revival of the history of Bruce's Beach and its incorporation into public record emerged in the first decades of the 21st century. The Bruce's Beach enclave and its visitors, we must not forget about the visitors, were not alone in facing harassment actions discouraging African Americans from visiting and settling in particular beach locales as the region's population increased during the 1920s. During this decade, several Save the Beach campaigns were implemented to keep African Americans from creating or maintaining beachfront resorts at other Southern California beach towns. I discuss these other cases in detail in my book. were confrontations and assaults across decades, some of which turned violent, aimed to inhibit African Americans' public beach usage. The most coveted California recreation and relaxation destination then and now. Black citizens mounted legal challenges to these discriminatory practices endeavored by whites. Even with such white violence and attempts to evict African Americans from various public beach spaces along the California coast, this community's days of recreation and relaxation occurred unabated. They were undeterred by white Americans' attempts to harass, molest, intimidate, or restrict them from California public beaches. In their first organized civil disobedience protest action in the region, members of the Los Angeles branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1927 challenged Manhattan Beach officials when they tried additional measures to make the beach white only. Although the Bruce's Beach community was destroyed, when the NAACP members staged a swim-in protest for which they were arrested and fined through legal maneuvers, clarification was won that African Americans had the right to enjoy this and all California beaches. This was an important civil rights and beach access victory, not just for African Americans with this accomplishment. It was an important act for all Californians. In the coming decades, with this accomplishment, African Americans' more confident assertion of their legal rights contributed to racial restriction attempts by whites at the state's public beaches fading away. As the 20th century advanced, African Americans around the US would increasingly utilize legal actions and public protests to dismantle legally sanctioned, along with informally enforced discrimination and segregation in public accommodations. The park would not be constructed until the late 1950s, 40 years after the small African American remote enclave was demolished. After many years and waves of local citizens, sometimes contentious, public discussion about their municipality's heritage and struggle with their ugly history, in 2007, Manhattan Beach's politi, under the leadership of then Mayor Mitchell Ward, renamed the Pacific Ocean Park site Bruce's Beach, with a descriptive text plaque that featured gross inaccuracies and this is 80 years after the Black resort community was destroyed. The public commemoration opened up broader claims for not just public memory, but also American identity, even with the signage text that dilutes, misrepresents, and partially omits the site's historical truths and understanding. Fast forward to 2020, Bruce's Beach became a site of conscious and reflection for memorial and celebratory events after the global movement for racial justice in the wake of the horrifying police murder of George Floyd. During this time period, the idea of the Bruce family land being returned to their descendants reemerged with a more heightened sense of urgency. Joining this global moment, Manhattan Beach residents proposed new interpretive panels and artwork on the Bruce's Beach Park site that the city owns to tell the story in a fuller fashion. The Manhattan Beach City Council acknowledged and condemned their predecessor's racist land grab that forced the Bruce and other Black families out of the area, but they stopped short of formally apologizing. Meanwhile, California State and local and Los Angeles County public officials passed legislation to allow for the return of the beachfront property owned by Los Angeles County to the descendants of Charles and Willa Bruce, for whom it was wrongfully taken in the 1920s. This is an extraordinary example of what reparations could look like in California and across the nation in some situations. As Supervisor Hahn has already mentioned, this would be the first time that land would be returned to African Americans as a way of making amends for various discriminatory policies in California and most likely the nation. What Los Angeles County and state leaders are doing opens up new ways of thinking about how to redress the legacy of social injustices done to African Americans that have not been fully explored in the past. The Restitution Act of giving the land back to the Bruce descendants could provide opportunities for potential accrued generational wealth that was lost. It will provide some psychological healing for the loss of opportunity for the family descendants and for the African American community in general. These moves are a good thing, but we must think more deeply about the events of 100 years ago and their legacy. This restitution will not provide tangible benefits to the purged African Americans of all classes from Manhattan Beach that lost out on a vibrant socioeconomic cultural space where today in this city, they make up less than half a percentage point of the 35,000 people that live in this city of Manhattan Beach. For broader social justice to occur, our public officials need to implement innovative public programs which encourage African American cultural, social, economic attainment opportunities in Manhattan Beach, at other California beaches, and beyond. The renamed park, Bruce's Beach, has already created some cross-racial justice and community benefit in an identified sense of place in the landscape of America, California, and Manhattan Beach that allows for a more culturally inclusive, collective civic identity and social history encompassing a public memory. It is important to integrate the omitted and once forgotten stories and more problematic and controversial and sensitive aspects of our national experience into the national narrative, as these stories show how the past influences the present and where we as a nation should go in the future. The park name is Commemorative Justice for the Bruce's Beach pioneers and Black Angelenos, as it honors their ambitions and initiatives that challenged the era's white supremacist ideals as they asserted their determination to have a broader vision of themselves and their community to participate in the 1920 era cultural and social economic trends. The land return will hopefully join the Bruce name on the park to honor the memory of the many African Americans who enjoyed the beach and struggled for their California dream during the Jim Crow era and beyond. We, as citizens and public officials, should invest in and promote history and civic education and other efforts that recognize marginalized groups and their heritage in Manhattan Beach and elsewhere through our intentional actions of inclusiveness and diversity for social justice, and not talking points for the appearance of political correctness. In closing, like many white Americans, Black Americans were lured to California for its opportunities and the good life energy produced by writers, painters, photographers, movie makers, which were used by various boosters promoting migration to the state. The stories and imagery of African Americans who participated in various phases of the Western migration and settlement continue to remain largely absent from the dominant mythologies and history surrounding the westward migration, notwithstanding investigation of the Black West published during the last 60 years. These commemorative environmental and social justice actions I have shared today recognize that African Americans have a right to historical and cultural sites, a place in the American identity, and the joys of cultural expression, along with self-fulfillment and wealth development. They also have a right to clean air, clean water, and in the enjoyment of all of America's resources. I hope you will take time to learn about these forgotten Black Western pioneers and ponder the implications of their stories for our lives today by buying my book and reading it. And I thank you today for sharing this time with me. I want to give a plug for another project that I have just completed, which is about the African American experience in Santa Monica, the Belmar History Plus Art Project. And I hope that you guys will take a look at my website and learn about the essay, the lesson plans, and the outdoor exhibition that's in Santa Monica at 4th and Pico. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jefferson. Thank you so much for that presentation. You know, we have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask both you and Dominique, but I really want to have an opportunity to open it up to our many, many attendees. The numbers stayed solid throughout your entire presentation, so I think that there are going to be some really great questions for you. So let me go ahead and get started. Let me start with Dominique. What did you think about all of that? What are your reactions to some of the things that Dr. Jefferson shared with us today?
Well, you know, thank you, first of all, Skye, and thank you to the LA County Library for inviting me. I love the work of Dr. Jefferson. I've been tracking it for some time because she's very detailed and she really has receipts. She brings the receipts. Right. So these are not platitudes. I recommend the book. It's kind of a journey for those of us who have been living in Southern California for a long time, but haven't been aware of this history. It's very eye-opening. And for me, it connects to the continuum of now, where I feel like we continue to struggle to find our place in these recreation spaces. I imagine when she says, you know, less than 1% of the 35,000 residents of Manhattan Beach are African American. And I think, had Bruce's Beach remained and the communities that were springing up around it, had they remained, what would that percentage be today? And it reminds me that many of these spaces that we think of exclusive of us, and by us I'm talking about people of color, BIPOC people, they are that way intentionally. It's not a coincidence. And so I think when we talk about, you know, our right to be partaking in the beauty and the public spaces and the natural beauty of the state of California, that has to be an intentional return, just as it has been an intentional exclusion.
That's great. Thank you for that. I have a question here about Bruce's Beach. So beyond Bruce's Beach, there are vast numbers of places around the nation with deep connections to the racially and minoritized communities. Obviously, there's a significant amount of work to be done to make historical sites more inclusive of the underrepresented. So in this time of truth-telling and reckoning, excuse me, how do you think we should start making historical sites and landmarks more inclusive and create a sense of belonging for racially minoritized groups? That's the question for both of you.
Well, I mean, oh, go ahead, Dr. Jefferson.
We need to make sure that we are supporting knowledge production of, you know, content. I mean, you know, supporting historians to be able to write these histories, supporting institutions like the LA County Library and other libraries to develop repositories of documents about the BIPOC community, and then supporting the use of those archives in knowledge production of various types, in scholarly works, in public displays in our communities, in public displays, I mean exhibitions in museum, but I also mean public monuments. So a big thing that education, in terms of supporting education in schools with lesson plans about, you know, our community. All of these things are important to making this history more known to the public. And it is happening on some level, not as fast as we would like, but there's a lot more African American and other scholars of color who have, and some of our white allies who have invested in making sure that this knowledge production happens. And then, you know, people like Dominique in the media need to get interested in these stories. She is, but some other people need to get interested in these stories and help to share them with the public.
Yeah, I agree with that so much, because so much of this is about normalizing things, right? And so when we talk about it all the time and people say, oh, this is real, this is happening, this isn't a fantasy, it does have a domino effect. It has a domino effect in consciousness, and hopefully a domino effect, as Supervisor Hahn so beautifully put it, in terms of the return of lands, the re-examining of how things got to be the way they are. And I think that what Dr. Jefferson is saying is absolutely correct. I would take it a step further and say we need to look at policy. We need to look at housing. We need to look at how it is that we've been excluded. How do we undo what the housing covenants did in Los Angeles? How do we undo what eminent domain has done? You look at what is happening in the city of Santa Monica. So they're saying, okay, for everyone who is displaced by the 10 freeway, we're going to put you at the top of the list for affordable housing. It's nice. I'm glad they're doing something. But at the same time, I'm saying, to me, that's like, you stole my car, and now your idea of repairing that is you're going to rent me back my car at a discount. To me, that doesn't go far enough. I need the car back, and then I need interest for all the years you've had the car. And then hopefully I would somehow get back the benefit of having been able to drive that car around and go everywhere I wanted to go, rather than being on the bus, if you follow my metaphor.
So glad that you brought that situation up in Santa Monica, because I feel like the people that were displaced, when most of them were homeowners, in the freeway situation is just a slap in the face. It's like, why can't you give them some more? I mean, they're descendants, because most of those people are dead now, but there's some descendants, some mortgage money.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like something was taken from me, and what I get in return is I get to be on a list. No.
Yes, I'll tell you, I followed that metaphor very clearly. Thank you for that. You know, I have a secondary question, and maybe it's more of a comment. Well, first, two things. I did really look at the Manhattan Beach area when I first moved to Los Angeles County. And for all the reasons that you've mentioned and even alluded to, it wasn't the place I ended up in. So that's a comment. A question that maybe an additional question is, do you feel like simply erecting new monuments, I'm going to go back to something that Dr. Jefferson started to talk about. Do you feel like simply erecting new monuments is the way, or is it the deliberate act of removing monuments that would create inclusion? Just out of curiosity.
We got to do both. We have to do both. We have to get rid of some of those racist monuments that which we have been doing, those racist Confederate monuments that support white supremacy. We have to keep getting rid of those, but we also then need to install some others that speak to the greater diversity of values in terms of ethnic identities and values in terms of all Americans seeking democracy, going after the values of the good life, all of these things. So it's both.
Yeah, both. And let's look at monuments as being beyond just like a statue. Like, how are you welcoming me into the space, or how are you keeping me out of the space? Let's look at the long legacy of Hollywood movies and television shows where beach equals blonde, blue-eyed. It definitely doesn't equal Black people. It doesn't equal Indigenous people. It doesn't equal Latino people, even though all of those folks were already here. So I think when we talk about monuments, we have to talk about, what are we creating with words and images in addition to what we put up in stone, and what that says about who is welcome and who is excluded.
Thank you for that. We're going to get into that in just a moment. I have a question that I want you all to, both of you, to answer. But before I do that, let me ask this question. So there's so many people, so many folks who are under the misconception that Southern California was largely untouched by the Jim Crow laws and segregation. As noted, clearly that's not true. And that Los Angeles area was relatively welcoming for African Americans. That recalls for me Isabel Wilkerson's book, Warmth of Other Suns, which is a few decades prior to your study here, Dr. Jefferson. The treatment of the Bruces and other African American families contradicts this notion. Why is it that history of racism is not well known in this area of the country? Supervisor Hahn alluded to it too. She said she's lived here her entire life and she didn't know. Can you both talk about this sort of moment of truth telling?
I think that it's a moment of truth telling. It's just that people had a misconception about what Los Angeles was about. Los Angeles was better in terms of racism, but what people forget is that racism was all over the United States. It wasn't, something that was just exclusive to the South. It happened in New York. It happened in Wisconsin. It happened in Iowa. It happened in Washington State. It happened in California. Now, each place had its own type of way in which they practice racism, whether it be through legal or informal practices. And in California, we didn't have Jim Crow laws. There were civil rights laws here in the state. Now you could argue about redlining and what have you, but that's a whole nother thing. So in terms of, laws, there were laws here that said that there's discrimination, as I mentioned, on the beach was illegal. Now, that didn't mean that people didn't try to do it, okay? And if you only had a small population that couldn't fight, you fought the best. You couldn't overturn everything. you circumvented it. The other thing about racism in California that people forget is that here it was better because of the fact that it wasn't institutionalized in law, but also you had people here who didn't want to participate, white people who didn't want to participate in it. So therefore, you might go to Sally's restaurant on Monday in 1920, and Sally is, hey, how you doing? And she serves you. But then you go in there tomorrow or Wednesday, and her brother Bob is at the counter. And he's like, I'm not going to serve you in the restaurant, but if you come around to the back. So it was not, you know, defined always in the way that it would be in the South.
I would argue that that's still the case, Dr. Jefferson. So, you know, if Bob is at the counter, you still might have to go around the back if you're in Beverly Hills or Bel Air. I think that California has a different kind of racial discrimination, as Dr. Jefferson has pointed out. Just because you don't see a plantation or a man with a whip doesn't mean you won't be checked. And I do believe that that is very insidious. I call Los Angeles a city of exits because most people stick to their own exit. You got the black exit, the brown exit, the Armenian exit. We are still very segregated to this day. And I feel like just because we have this hip image, and as Dr. Jefferson pointed out, you have allies, you got all kinds of eccentrics and artists and others here, it sort of glosses over it. But there's a reason why California is the first state in the nation to have a reparations task force. And that part of the uncovering that's happening with this task force is the fact that there were slaves held in this state, even though it wasn't considered a slave state. And the fact that the legacy of racism here in this state against Asian Americans, against Mexicans, and of course, most especially against Black people is significant. The fact that to this day, right now, 2022, California has more hate crimes than any other state against Asians and Black people, that should tell you something.
Thank you both for that. Wow, yeah. So you kind of both touched on this, but I'm going to ask the question specifically. And in your opinion, how does Bruce Beach fit into the larger conversation about race and, as Dominique mentioned, reparations?
Well, I think that this is part of a conversation about race and reparation. It's part of our reckoning that's, you know, we really talked about in 2020 about Black Lives Matter, about anti-racism, the battle for Black lives, which has been a window of opportunity to fight racism, white supremacy, discrimination against all peoples, all BIPOC peoples. I think this is super important. The Bruce's Beach story, because it looks at reparation, not just literally from our enslavement, but from all of the things and repercussions and echoes of our enslavement, Jim Crow, and the stealing of our wealth, which is part of what people's eyes were open to around the discussion of Greenwood and the Black Wall Street. And there's an element of hope where we can really see justice. This can happen not in 10 generations, but in our lifetime. The fact that the folks from Tulsa had to live to be over 100 years old to have a chance to tell their story to Congress, but yet they did it. That to me opens up a whole Pandora's chest of hope, a Pandora's chest of possibilities for the very many different kinds of ways that we can repair and reckon and move past and reclaim some of this generational wealth that has been lost, and opening people's eyes to why we have these racial gaps, these education gaps. Because even though the Bruce family gets back their property, they don't get back generations of the benefits of health benefits of living by the beach, or the educational opportunities that they might have had from living in that location or having that level of wealth, how that would impact their health outcomes, their mental health outcomes, their family trajectory. That they won't get back. But the hope and the kind of reimagining of what repair looks like that comes from the Bruce's Beach story, I think is very, very impactful.
That's so deep. Dominique and Dr. Jefferson, they're about to go in. I can see this already. So let me ask Dr. Jefferson a quick question here. I was kind of stuck on this one. Spatial justice, this is a new one for me. We often talk about libraries as the social infrastructure, as public investment, and the center of community for all people. First, can you kind of talk to us a little bit about what spatial justice mean, and how do you see the library and media bringing more awareness to this issue?
So we could talk about spatial justice in a lot of different realms. In the context of what I was thinking about as it relates to the book, I was thinking about physical space and also space in terms of what kinds of activities one might be participating in. And so that is the leisure activity. But in terms of the broader sense of the word of spatial justice, just having space in the American identity, in whatever way that might mean, from being a public intellectual to a radio talk show host to the head of the Los Angeles County Libraries, to the skateboarder on the street. And as Dominique had mentioned earlier, in terms of thinking about this concept of spatial justice, getting our stories into the presentations of movies and television shows and in songs and in artwork and all of that. And all of that is spatial justice as well. It just depends on how you want to frame it in terms of the context of what the conversation is in terms of subject matter.
Thank you for that. There's a secondary question to that, which is, how do you think that we can bring awareness to all of this while continuing to foster balance and open dialogue? And I'll tell you the reason I asked that question, because the library is the center of learning. And so we're a learning institution for a myriad of different views and political views. And so how do you think that we can continue to have this sort of open and fluid dialogue? How do you think the libraries can inform that?
By having a diversity of books in the library and doing programs like this.
Period.
Yeah, well, and I want to add to that. I want to commend the LA County Public Library and you, Director Patrick, for getting rid of the fines, for thinking about how does that impact families, all families across any political spectrum, their access, for thinking of the library as a community space, for giving us the spatial justice of having the airtime and the bandwidth for these kinds of conversations, which make the words dance off the page and make me want to run out and get this book. And I think that is part of it, is bringing the words to life and bringing the library to the community so that the community comes to the library and sees it not as a stuffy place full of dusty books, but as a welcoming space where there are resources, where, I mean, from the Wi-Fi in the parking lots, which we talked about on the radio, to, you know, to these kinds of discussions. I think it's really, really important what you guys are doing. And I just really commend you for that.
Thank you for that. I promise you I wasn't fishing for a compliment, but thank you for centering the library and the work that we do. This question again, this is another one for Dr. Jefferson. This was one that was near and dear to my heart. So understanding the scope of the book obviously was Southern California. But were there other places that didn't make the cut for this particular publication that you want to share with us?
I could have included Murray's Dude Ranch, which is in Apple Valley. And I didn't because it was just a big trek at the time for me to manage that. And there was also a young woman who was at UC Riverside who was interested in the topic, and she did something on it. So that would be, you know, one that I would have wanted to include, but, you know, we're gonna be continuing to talk about it in the exhibition that I'm working on with the California African American Museum that will be about these leisure sites, that opens in December 2022. So everyone stay tuned. And then in terms of Southern California, no, there weren't any other leisure places other than that one. I mean, there were some other places that they were like a blip on the map. People started them and they maybe lasted for a really short period of time. They couldn't get any traction. There is a historic African American beach community that was in La Jolla, but they were not like a resort. They were a community. And recently, in the last few years, the community's done a small book. And June Edmonds, a Los Angeles-based artist, has done a mural down there to commemorate that historic community It's in downtown La Jolla. I might have done a little more on, had it lasted, would have been the Pacific Beach Club in Huntington Beach, which was destroyed right when it opened, or was to open. I do talk about it in the book, but I didn't show any images. And had it been a longer book, I might have, talked more about it in terms of the loss and the business deal.
Dr. Jefferson, can you mention that exhibit again? You said it in December 2022, but I didn't hear where.
At the California African American Museum.
Oh, Cam, got you. Okay. This is my last question, because I really want an opportunity to open up this conversation with our live audience. And this question is directed to Dominique. So what are some of your thoughts on representation of African American experience in mainstream media? You've mentioned things like the movement for Black Lives, the placemaking of the restitution of Bruce's Beach, Hollywood and media actively investing in stories of people of color. But what's your thoughts around how we're portrayed in the media?
Well, I mean, I agree with Dr. Jefferson that the way we're getting portrayed in the media is improving, but the reason it's improving is because we're in the room more and because we're in the streets more. I think when we march and when you see the kind of mass mobilization that we saw in 2020, it does give people pause, right? I think people are getting more educated because of the anti-racist movement. Their eyes are starting to open. Some of the things that they would automatically do are happening less, but it's still very problematic. I believe there's this myth in the media. People think that they're objective. They want to be objective. They portray themselves as objective. I think it's fine to try to be balanced, but we must understand that we can only see the world through our own eyes, right? So there's a difference between being balanced, trying to be fair, and being objective. You're not objective. You're subjective. All human beings are. So that means there has to be representation. If we're not in the room, they're always going to miss things. And I think that's what you see a lot of, most especially with Black people still. And I think the more we are able to tell our own stories with a variety of voices along class lines, gender lines, sexual orientation, all of these things within the variety of what Black people are, brown people are, indigenous people are, that we're not a monolith. The more voices, the more we will have a truly textured and nuanced kind of presentation about who we are. I think we're moving in that direction. I think we have a long, long way to go. And I want to say before I forget, I have 2 shows coming up in February, one on February 7th, one on February 9th, with Kevon Ward of Justice for Bruce's Beach, where we are going to talk about 2 new cases that they are taking on with the organization Where's My Land, which is going beyond Bruce's Beach. They have over 200 cases, African American people throughout the nation who have had land taken somewhere throughout their family history, who have the receipts, and they're trying to do campaigns similar to what happened with Bruce's Beach. So we'll spotlight a couple of those on KBLA Talk 1580, and hopefully you can join me then and we can continue this conversation.
I love that. Thank you so much. I have a quick question here. Someone wants to know, Dominique, where's your book? What's the name of your book?
Ha! Well, I'm really inching along. I am actually writing, but after this, I'm going to write even more, and I don't know the name of it yet. But I'm writing about the intersection of politics and pop culture, which is pretty much where I live.
That's right. Well, we just want to know that you are dedicating some time to write that book. And we heard that Dr. Jefferson is working on a new project for Santa Monica. So I'm going to try and sift through these questions. There are a lot of them.
Excuse me, I'm not working on a new project for Santa Monica.
That is a project
that is already established and people can go and look at it now. But I wanted to say something about the representation of African Americans in popular media. And in terms of where we are with the struggle, you asked the question to both of us. So the thing about representation in popular stories, I agree with Dominique that, you know, we have to be in the room to be able to, as Black people and other communities of color, to tell our stories. The struggle will continue. And we have to keep remembering that we're in a wave of progress right now in terms of a next level wave of the struggle, but it is not over by any means.
Thank you, and I apologize for that slight snafu. There are so many questions in the chat. Let me start with this one. Someone says it's time to talk to the Bruce's family about what they think. Anyone on this call talk to the Bruce's family recently?
I had a very casual conversation, actually at a party, and that's how I ended up having Kavon Ward on my show one time already and 2 times coming up, because they were asking that we allow her to speak to tell their story. So that's the way that I move forward.
Thank you.
So in terms of talk, I'm not sure I understand the question that you're asking at this point.
Sure. I didn't make the question. I'm reading from the chat, but I'm going to make the assumption that they're wanting to know whether or not the Bruces have opined on this new iteration, the family, the lineage, whether or not they have an opinion. Have they been vocal about it? I think I'm gathering that's what the question is asking.
Okay. So yes, the Bruce family has, they've made comments about where we are today with the land restoration and some of the things that have been articulated about the reparations campaign that's going forward. I'm not a spokesman for the family, but you know, there's some media things that are out there and you can find some quotes from them.
Thank you, Dr. Jefferson. This one's from Rebecca. It says, what do you suggest to someone who is interested in reclaiming their ancestral land outside of California? I know Dominique kind of alluded to this bigger thing happening, Where's My Land? Any comments on how you suggest people start trying to reclaim their lands?
Where'smyland.com. There's actually a form you can fill out on the website where you can tell your family story and get in touch with Where's My Land. It's some of the same people that worked on the Bruce's Beach victory so far, and I think they're gathering information and new facts. I would also consider at least trying to tell your story to the reparations task force here in California, or if there is one in the city near where your land was stolen, I think that would also be a good idea.
And so this is, go ahead.
I think that whoever is trying to look at claiming some land outside of the United States outside of California, needs to take a look at what's going on in that particular area because there may be some things that are happening that you may not be aware of right now, and also and because you might be able to participate in something that's already ongoing.
Thank you. So another question from the audience. What do you think of California Reparations Task Force? What kinds of actions do you expect, hope, demand coming out of their work?
So I participated in the task force, one of the task force meetings in December. And I talked about the opportunities that were lost of African Americans along the coast. And I'm hopeful that the Reparations Task Force will come up with some innovative and creative ways to help the situation of the legacy of discrimination in California that will be beneficial to all of us. Right now, I can't say what that will be, but my big one is put some money in knowledge production, put some money in libraries, put some money in education. That will go a long way to helping many people in California.
Yeah, I think the thing with the Reparations Task Force, number one, it's the first one on a state level in the United States. That's super significant. Thank you to Dr. Shirley Weber. Thank you to Governor Newsom for signing the thing and for all the activists who pushed to make it happen. This sets a precedent, and hopefully we'll see it in other states. We're seeing it in other cities and counties. That's important. That creates momentum. Hopefully we will see HR 40 at some point come out of committee, get a vote on the floor, and we'll see a study happening at the national level. That would be the next step on a national level. The task force is gathering information, and actually it's not too late for you to participate. And what they need is they need to find out about all the ways that our enslavement and Jim Crow discrimination and other forms of racial discrimination impacted the potential, the wealth, and the thriving of Black Californians. So any and all information is important. It's being welcomed. People complain, why are we doing a study? We need to get right to the repair. We have to do a study. That is how they figure out what needs to happen. That's how they justify any expenditures. And that's how you tell the story. I've interviewed Japanese Americans who worked on their restitution, and they've said to me that Ron Wakabayashi specifically said to me that one of the biggest things that moved the needle for them was people hearing the stories, the real human impacts of what slavery, Jim Crow, white supremacy has done to families for generations. And I think that's where we are right now.
Thank you both for that. On that line, we have another question from the audience. How do we begin to repair the Native American injustices?
Okay, so that's a huge question. Again, with the movement, the racial reckoning, the anti-racism movement, and even though there's this sort of counter pull of, trying to erase history and a backlash against critical race theory and all of this anti-intellectualism that's happening, on the other hand, there's a real intellectual reckoning. We're starting to see this. We're starting to see the reckoning with what has happened to Indigenous people, whether it's the children's bones being dug up at these boarding schools in Canada. Now we're seeing the reckoning here in the United States, whether it's some of the departments of Children and Family Services taking a look at how Indigenous people have been discriminated against, providing now even in LA, more accurate translation so that we don't assume that Indigenous people speak Spanish, so that they are not having their children removed simply because of language barriers. These things are starting to happen, and they only happen same way they happen for Black people, when we protest, when we show up, and when we demand change.
Thank you. Dr. Jefferson, do you want to respond to that?
I agree with what Dominique said.
Yeah, well said. It looks like we have time for one more question. I have several, but I'm going to end with this one because this was a question I had for you, Dr. Jefferson, as well, reading your book. Could you comment on the inkwell back east? Probably you were focused on SoCal, but the community is fascinating. You talked about the inkwell a little bit. Can you, one, tell us why that's derogatory, or in most communities derogatory, and then this person is specifically interested in the inkwell back east.
So there were several places around the country that were called the inkwell that were related to African Americans around water culture. And the one in the Martha's Vineyard area in Massachusetts was one of the earlier ones. And it was there was a community of African Americans that were living on the island of Martha's Vineyard. And there was a resort community that developed with around the time that the Methodists were there in the 1800s with the revival camps. And Black people formed their own little community there for the revival camps because the white folks wouldn't let them stay in the Methodist revival camp. And then that evolved in the 20th century to this more middle class resort area that we are familiar with today. And it's had different iterations over time, but that's kind of the general story. It's a small beach area that's in the city of Oak Bluff that African Americans would hang out at, that was near where they lived. And again, it was well, not again, it was a negative term that white folks first used to talk about the skin color of the people that were hanging out at this particular place. In California, in Los Angeles, at Santa Monica's Bay Street Beach area, that was sometimes also called the inkwell for the same reason, because of African Americans hanging out there in front of the public park and because of their skin color. In contemporary times, some people don't find that name derogatory. They've repurposed it and take it more as a badge of pride. But there's a lot of people who don't like the name and don't want you calling their spaces by those names. And I know from my research with folks who lived through the Jim Crow era here, who would go to the beach in Santa Monica and go to the beach in Venice, they never called the beach the inkwell in Santa Monica. If they were going to the beach in Santa Monica, they would say, we're going, and they were talking to Black people, they would say, we're going to the beach in Santa Monica. And everybody knew where they were talking about. It wasn't about necessarily naming it. And in terms of, the inkwell or Bay Street or whatever. And later, later, some white folks were calling it Spook Beach. That was the 50s and the 60s.
Thank you, Dr. Jefferson. I'm going to refrain from having a comment on that. Dr. Jefferson, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Dominique, thank you so much for both of you participating in our first Heart and Hand program. This was a huge success from my vantage point. To the audience, thank you all for sticking in here. We welcome your feedback. We encourage you, we ask you, maybe even beg of you, to take the survey. Let us know what you thought about this. Let us know what you'd like to hear us have a conversation about in the future. And thank you all for being here. I want to thank the library staff, our marketing team, Debbie Anderson and her team, and the book club readers. We had a group of librarians also read your book so we can all talk about it and ask very thoughtful questions. So thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.